The letter had come in a plain brown envelope, and at first he almost threw it away. It looked like the usual bills and notices that filled his small mailbox every week. But something about the handwriting made him pause. It was written in an older style, neat and careful, the kind that reminded him of a different time. He tore it open slowly, sitting on the steps of his tiny rented apartment. And as his eyes moved over the words, he felt the ground shift under his feet. A distant uncle, someone he barely remembered, had left him an inheritance. Not money, not jewelry, but a ranch and old, forgotten ranch in the countryside. For a long moment, he didn't know whether to laugh or sigh. A ranch. He had never owned land before. He had grown up moving from one small place to another, never staying anywhere long enough to plant roots. He'd worked odd jobs in the city, jobs that paid just enough to get by, but never gave him more than survival. The idea of owning something as big as a ranch felt strange, almost unreal. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He decided he would at least see it with his own eyes. The drive out to the countryside took hours, and with every mile, the city noise faded into silence. Tall grasses stretched along the roadside, the fields rolling like waves in the breeze. The air smelled different, fresher, as if it carried memories of another world. He thought about his uncle, a man who had chosen land and cattle over city life. He wondered why his uncle had chosen him of all people to carry the family's land forward. Maybe because he had no one else. When he finally reached the dirt road leading to the ranch, the sun was beginning to set. The sky turned shades of gold and orange, and the land around him glowed as if welcoming him home. But as he drove further, the first impression was not one of welcome. The wooden fences were broken in places, leaning like tired old men. The gate creaked when he pushed it open, the hinges screaming with rust. The house itself stood tall but weary, its paint peeling and windows covered in dust. He felt both sadness and wonder-sadness for the years of neglect, wondered that something this big now belonged to him. He parked his old truck in front of the ranch house and stepped out. The earth crunched under his boots and silence surrounded him. Not the empty silence of loneliness, but the kind that held secrets. He looked around and noticed small things that didn't match the idea of abandonment. The porch had a broom leaning against the wall, as if someone had used it not long ago. The yard had footprints in the dirt, not old and faded, but fresh, like someone had walked there that very morning. Frowned, his heart beating a little faster. The lawyer's letter had been clear. The ranch was his now. But who had been here before him? He decided to explore. Pushing open the front door, he stepped into the house. Dust floated in the golden light, yet the air didn't smell entirely stale. The wooden floors creaked under his weight, and though the furniture was old, some of it seemed recently touched. A blanket folded neatly on a chair, a teapot on the stove that looked like it had been used. He froze. This place wasn't empty. Someone was living here. For a moment, unease crawled over him. He imagined squatters or strangers who had taken over while the ranch sat unclaimed. But when he looked out the window, he noticed something else, a thin stream of smoke rising from behind the barn. His curiosity pulled him outside. The wind carried the smell of wood fire, and as he drew closer, he heard voices. Soft voices, women's voices, carrying a tone of calm mixed with sorrow. He stopped when he saw them. 5 women sat near the fire pit, their heads closed as they spoke quietly. They looked up together, their faces reflecting the flames. They were not strangers to hardship. Their clothes were simple and worn, their eyes carrying stories of years gone by. Yet there was also dignity in the way they sat, strength in the way they looked at him without fear. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had expected an empty ranch, broken walls, and maybe a few wild animals. He had not expected this 5 widows, sitting on land that was now legally his. The silence stretched long, heavy with questions. Finally, one of them stood. She was older than the rest, perhaps in her late 40s, her hair streaked with silver, but her posture straight. She met his eyes steadily and spoke with a calm voice. "You must be him, the heir. We wondered when you would come." Her words made his chest tighten. They had been waiting for him. But why? Another woman, younger, maybe in her 30s, spoke softly. "We have been here since our husbands passed. We kept the land alive as much as we could. It isn't much, but it is the only home we have." He listened, his throat dry. They weren't intruders, they were survivors. The 5 widows had been bound to the ranch by circumstance, by grief, and by necessity. Each one carried a different kind of loss, but together they had built a fragile shelter of companionship. They had watched over the ranch when no one else had cared for it. The man stood still, torn between disbelief and compassion, he thought. About his own life, how he had wandered without roots, how he had longed for a place that felt like home. And now, here it was, a ranch full of history, guarded by women who had nowhere else to go. As the night deepened, he sat with them by the fire. They spoke little, but in the quiet, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. The land around him no longer felt empty, it felt alive, filled with unseen hands that had tended it through sorrow. He realized the inheritance was not just fences and fields, it was people, too. People waiting for him to decide what came next, and for the first time in his life, he understood that this journey was not about what he would gain, but about what he was meant to protect. The next morning, sunlight spilled over the old ranch, painting the fields in soft gold. The man awoke in a room that smelled faintly of wood and earth. The bed was old but clean, a quilt carefully laid out. For a moment, he wondered who had made the room ready. He was sure he had arrived to find it dusty and empty. Yet someone had cared enough to prepare it. He realized the 5 women had been expecting him longer than he thought. When he stepped outside, he found them already at work. 2 of them were near the chicken coop feeding the hens. Another was mending a piece of clothing on the porch. The older one, the silver-haired woman who had spoken to him last night, was sweeping the yard. The youngest was carrying water from the well, her steps steady, even though the bucket was heavy. It was clear they were used to keeping the ranch alive, even without men around. He cleared his throat, unsure how to begin. They all paused, turning their eyes toward him. It was not hostility he saw, but watchfulness. They wanted to know who he was, what kind of man had inherited this land, and whether he would let them stay. "I didn't know anyone was here," he said finally, his voice low. The lawyer never mentioned it. The older woman set the broom aside and walked closer. Her face carried lines of both sorrow and strength. "We have been here for years. After our husbands passed, there was nowhere else to go. We kept the ranch from falling apart as best we could. Your uncle allowed it. He said this land should never be left to die." The man felt a tug in his chest. He remembered his uncle vaguely, a stern but fair man who had spent his life on horseback working the soil and the cattle. It made sense that his uncle would let widows stay. The old man had always respected hard work. Another woman, the one who had been mending clothes, spoke. Her voice was gentle but carried pain. "We are 5 widows. Different stories, same fate. Some of us lost husbands to accidents in the fields, some to sickness, and some to the dangers of the frontier. We had no homes, no families to turn to. This ranch became our last shelter." He nodded slowly, listening. Each word they spoke seemed heavy with truth. He looked at them more carefully. They were not weak or helpless. Each of them had weathered storms of life. They had survived loss, hunger, loneliness, and still stood tall. The youngest, the one with the water bucket, finally broke her silence. Her eyes were deep brown, filled with both innocence and quiet strength. "We know this ranch is yours now," she said softly. "If you tell us to leave, we will have no choice, but we ask only for mercy. This land is all we have." The man's heart twisted. He thought about his own life, how he had struggled to keep even a roof over his head. He understood the fear in her voice. He had known what it was like to stand on the edge of losing everything. Instead of answering right away, he joined them in their tasks. He helped repair a broken fence post, his hands rough but steady. He fetched tools from the barn and worked beside them. At first, the women seemed surprised, maybe even doubtful, but as the hours passed, their glances softened. They saw he was not afraid of work, that he was not there to lord over them, but to learn and share the burden. Over lunch, they sat together in the shade of the porch. The meal was simple fresh eggs, bread, and beans, but it tasted better than anything he had eaten in months. The women spoke little at first, but soon their stories came out. One by one, the silver-haired woman was named Clara. She had once been married to a rancher who died in a cattle stampede. She had carried the pain of that day for years, yet she had not let it break her spirit. She had become like a mother to the others, guiding them with her quiet wisdom. The one who sewed clothes was Anna. She had been the wife of a blacksmith. He had fallen ill during a harsh winter, leaving her alone with nothing but her skill with needle and thread. She survived by making clothes for neighbors and had eventually found her. Way to the ranch, the young woman who carried the water was Ruth. Her husband had been a soldier who never returned from war. She was the youngest widow, still in her 20s, and the sadness of losing her husband so early was etched in her eyes. Yet she worked harder than most, determined not to be seen as weak. The fourth, quiet and serious, was named Margaret. She had lost her husband in a mining accident. With no children and no family left, she had wandered until Clara welcomed her to the ranch. Margaret was strong with animals, often calming even the most restless horse. The last widow was Ellen. She had once lived in a town, but left after her husband died of fever and people turned cold toward her. She carried herself with quiet grace, and though she rarely spoke when she did, her words were filled with sense. Listening to them, the man felt humbled. Each of them had a history filled with heartbreak, yet they had built a sisterhood stronger than blood. The ranch was not just a place for them, it was proof of survival. That night, as he lay in the old bed again, he stared at the wooden ceiling and thought about the decision he faced. He had inherited the ranch, but it was more than land now. It was the home of 5 women who had given everything to keep it alive. If he forced them out, they would be broken. If he sold it, their years of struggle would be wasted. And if he stayed, it could become something new, something more than just soil and fences. The wind rattled the windows, and he pulled the quilt tighter around himself. He realized the ranch was not only testing his strength, it was testing his heart. These women were not strangers anymore. They had become part of his inheritance too. For the first time, he wondered if this lonely land might not be so lonely after all. The days passed slowly but steadily on the ranch, and the man began to learn more about the life that had been kept alive there. The widows welcomed his help, though at first they still watched him carefully, as if unsure whether he would stay or leave. He felt the weight of their eyes, but he understood their caution. They had seen many promises in life fall apart. Trust was something that could not be given easily. Still, he worked beside them every day. He learned to feed the chickens, mend fences, and clean the barn. Clara, the oldest widow, showed him how to check the cattle for sickness. Margaret taught him how to calm the horses, whispering to them until their nervousness faded. Anna sewed his torn shirt without being asked, shaking her head with a small smile at how clumsy he was with needles. Ruth carried water with him from the well, laughing softly when he pretended the buckets were too heavy for his arms. Ellen, quiet as always, offered him advice about the soil and when to plant. Slowly, he realized they were teaching him not only about the ranch, but about responsibility, patience, and care. But while the ranch grew more alive each day, the world outside was not so kind. The nearby town had long known about the widows staying at the ranch. Some people whispered cruelly that the ranch was cursed because of so much death. Others said the widows had no right to the land and should leave now that a rightful heir had come. A few men even eyed the land greedily, wondering if the new owner would sell it for quick money. One afternoon, the man went into town to buy supplies. As he loaded sacks of flour and salt onto his wagon, he overheard voices behind him. "So, he finally showed up," one man said. "Bet he won't last long. That ranch is nothing but a burden." "Or maybe he'll sell," another added. "Wouldn't blame him. No reason to live out there with those women?" Their laughter burned in his ears. He wanted to turn and argue, but he bit his tongue. Fighting would prove nothing. Still, as he drove back to the ranch, the words stuck in his mind. The widows had lived with such judgment for years. Now he was tied to it too. That evening, as the widows prepared supper, he told them what he had heard. Clara's face stayed calm, though her eyes were heavy. "We have heard such words before," she said. "People think widows are weak, or worse, a burden. They don't see how hard we've worked to keep this place standing." Ruth lowered her eyes, stirring the pot slowly. "They think we should disappear. But where would we go? This ranch is the only place that has not turned us away." Her quiet words broke something inside him. He realized then that his choice mattered not only for himself, but for them too, as if to test his resolve. Trouble came sooner than expected. A group of men rode up to the ranch one morning, their horses kicking up dust. They claimed they were neighbors, but their tone was sharp, their eyes full of calculation. The leader, a tall man with a thick mustache, leaned on his saddle and looked around. "Word is, you're the new owner," he said. "This place is too big for one man and a few women. If you're smart, you'll sell it now before it swallows you whole." The man stood tall, though his hands tightened into fists at his sides. "This ranch isn't for sale," the mustached man laughed. "You'll regret that. Land like this is hard. Better men have failed to keep it alive. Don't say we didn't warn you." The group rode off, leaving behind only the echo of their laughter and the unease that settled over the yard. The widows looked shaken, but none of them spoke. It was Ellen, quiet as always, who finally whispered, "They will come again." The man knew she was right. There would be more whispers, more pressure. Some would want the land, some would simply want the widows gone. And he stood in the middle, holding the key to what would happen next. That night, he could not sleep. He walked outside under the stars, listening to the wind rustle through the grass. The ranch stretched wide and silent, a place filled with both hope and hardship. He thought about leaving, selling it all, and walking away. It would be easier. He could return to the city, to his small life, and never face the weight of responsibility again. But then he remembered Ruth's voice, soft and broken. "This is the only place that has not turned us away." The words would not leave him. He realized leaving would mean turning them away too. The next morning, he rose with a clear decision. He gathered the widows by the porch and spoke plainly. "I know people doubt us. I know men will come trying to take what isn't theirs, but I won't sell this ranch. I won't abandon it, and I won't abandon you. If this land is mine, then so are its people. We'll stand together." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Clara stepped forward, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "Your uncle would be glad to hear you say that. He believed in this land, and now you do too." The widows nodded, one by one, their faces softening. A new bond had formed between them, not just of survival, but of trust. The ranch was no longer a question of ownership. It was a promise of unity. Still, challenges remained. Fences needed repair, fields needed planting, and the house needed fixing. It was hard work, endless and tiring. Yet as they worked side by side, laughter slowly returned. Anna told small stories of her husband's forge. Ruth hummed old songs while carrying water, and Margaret's calm way with the horses gave them strength. Even Ellen, quiet and observant, surprised them. All one evening, by telling a story from her town days that made everyone smile, the man felt something change inside him. For the first time, he was not drifting or surviving alone. He was part of something bigger, a family not built by blood, but by choice. And though whispers and threats still hovered around the edges of their world, he felt certain that as long as they stood together, they could face whatever came. As the sun set over the wide fields that evening, the man looked out across the land. The fences might be broken, the soil might be dry, but he saw more than hardship. He saw life, hope, and a future. And he knew deep in his heart that the ranch was not just his inheritance, it was his destiny. The ranch had begun to feel alive again. The fences were slowly being repaired, the barns cleaned, and the animals tended with care. Every day was filled with work, but it was good work. The man often found himself pausing to watch the widows as they moved about the land. Clara with her steady wisdom, Ruth with her energy, Anna with her gentle patience, Margaret with her skill with the animals, and Ellen with her quiet guidance. Each of them had found a rhythm with him, as if they had been waiting all along for someone to stand beside them. But peace never lasts long when envy stirs in the hearts of others. The neighbors who had warned him about selling returned, this time not with laughter but with anger. It started with small things. Tools went missing from the shed. A water trough was tipped over in the night. Cattle broke through fences that had been deliberately cut. Each morning brought a new sign that someone wanted the ranch to fail. The man tried not to show worry, but the widows noticed. One evening, as they gathered for supper, Margaret spoke firmly. "Someone is trying to break us. They think if they push hard enough, we'll give up the land." Clara nodded slowly. "Your uncle faced the same trouble. Men who wanted what wasn't theirs. But he never gave in, and neither should we." The man looked around the table at them. Their faces were tired, but strong. "We'll stand together," he said, his voice steady. "This ranch is ours now, and no one can drive us off." But the real test came with the storm. It was late one afternoon when the sky began to darken. Heavy clouds rolled in from the horizon, and the air grew thick and heavy. By evening, the wind howled like a wild beast, rattling the windows and bending the trees. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the yard into a river of mud inside the house. The widows gathered near the fire, while the man rushed from room to room checking for leaks. Suddenly, a crash echoed from outside the barn roof, was beginning to give way under the force of the storm. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and rushed into the rain. Margaret followed him, shouting to the others to stay safe. Together, they fought against the wind, pulling ropes and hammering boards to hold the barn together. Lightning split the sky and thunder shook the ground. The cattle inside bellowed in fear, kicking against the stalls. Ruth appeared, soaked to the bone, her eyes wide but determined. "They'll hurt themselves if we don't calm them," she cried, rushing inside the barn. The man followed, trying to steady the animals. Margaret's calm voice cut through the storm as she spoke to the horses, her hands firm on their reins. Slowly they settled, though the wind still roared outside. Back at the house, Clara, Anna, and Ellen worked to keep water from flooding through the door. They shoved blankets against the cracks, carried buckets, prayed the roof would hold. For hours the storm raged, tearing at everything in its path. When at last the winds began to die down, the ranch was a different place. The yard was littered with broken branches. The fence on the east side had collapsed, and part of the barn roof was gone. The widows stood in silence, their faces pale with exhaustion. The man wiped the rain from his eyes, his chest heaving. He looked around at the damage, and for a moment despair threatened to crush him. But then he saw the widows, each one standing tall despite the storm. Clara with her broom still in hand, Ruth with mud on her face, but fire in her eyes. Anna holding a soaked blanket, Margaret steadying a horse, and Ellen pressing her lips together in quiet determination. He realized then that storms could break wood and stone, but not the spirit of people who refused to give in. The next morning, they began to rebuild. Neighbors came, some out of curiosity, some out of pity, and a few even to offer help. But the man noticed how differently they looked at him now. He had not run from the storm. He had stood his ground, and the widows had stood with him. Still, the troublemakers did not disappear. A week later, the mustached man returned with two others. They claimed the ranch was too damaged to be worth saving. "Sell it to us," he said. "You'll save yourself years of hardship." The man stood firm. "This ranch isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." Clara stepped forward beside him, her voice steady. "We've already survived more than you can imagine. No storm, no loss, and no man will take this home from us." The men sneered, but something in her voice silenced them. They rode off, though their eyes promised trouble. That night, the widows sat quietly around the fire, their faces thoughtful. Anna finally spoke. "You could leave if you wanted. You don't owe us anything. But you stayed. You fought with us." The man looked at her, then at all of them. "This ranch is not just mine. It's ours. You've worked harder for it than anyone, and I won't abandon that. We are in this together." For the first time since he had arrived, smiles spread across their faces. Not just polite smiles, but ones filled with trust. The bond between them had grown into something unbreakable. As the fire crackled, Ruth whispered, "Maybe the storm was meant to test us. And maybe we proved we belong here?" The man nodded. He knew she was right. The storm had tried to tear them apart, but instead, it had pulled them closer together. And in the quiet of that night, as the ranch rested under the stars, he felt a new kind of strength take root in his heart. The ranch was not just a place of work and survival. It was a place of family, forged in hardship and bound by courage. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as one. The storm had passed, and the men who came with greed had been sent away. Yet the ranch was still fragile, like a wounded animal that needed care and patience to heal. Broken fences stretched across the land, roof shingles still scattered, and deep mud covered the paths. But to the man and the 5 widows, it no longer looked like ruins. It looked like a challenge they were ready to face together. Morning after morning, they worked side by side. The man rose early, often before the sun, and stepped out to see Clara already sweeping the porch, her silver hair glowing in the dawn light. Margaret would be with the horses, speaking softly to them as if they understood every word. Anna sat near the window sewing, making repairs not just to clothes but to blankets and sacks that had torn in the storm. Ruth carried water and firewood with a smile that made even the hardest jobs lighter. Ellen, quiet as always, watched everything carefully and pointed out details others missed. Like a broken hinge on a gate or a loose latch on the chicken coop together, they began to mend not only the ranch, but also each other. The man noticed how Clara often stayed awake long into the night, staring at the fire, and he began to sit with her, listening to the stories of her late husband. He saw how Anna sometimes hid tears when she worked with her needle, and he reminded her gently that she was not alone anymore. Ruth still carried the weight of losing her husband in war, but when the man taught her how to ride one of the calmer horses, he saw her laughter return for the first time in years. Margaret, though strong, often looked toward the horizon with eyes full of longing, and the man would ask her about her dreams for the ranch, making her voice steadier each time she spoke. Ellen, though she rarely said much, began to trust him more. And one evening she surprised everyone by suggesting ways to plant crops that would grow faster in their soil. Word of their unity spread in the nearby town. At first, people still whispered, calling it strange that one man would live with 5 widows. But as the weeks turned into months, the whispers softened. The townsfolk saw the ranch coming back to life. They saw fences repaired, animals healthy, and fields beginning to show signs of green. The man had not abandoned the ranch as many expected. The widows had not been driven away. Instead, together, they had built something strong. Respect began to grow where there had once been doubt. One day, the same men who had mocked him in the store came to buy eggs and butter from the ranch. They avoided his eyes, but their presence said enough. Even those who had doubted now needed what the ranch produced. It was proof that perseverance had won. Seasons passed, and with them, the land changed. Spring brought blossoms that painted the edges of the fields. Summer was hot and dry, but they managed by working together, drawing water carefully and saving what they could. Autumn gave them their first real harvest since he had arrived, baskets of vegetables, jars of preserved fruit, and even enough grain to sell in town. Winter came with biting winds. But this time, the house was strong, the roof held, and the fire never went out. The man sometimes stood on the porch in the evenings, watching the widows as they worked or laughed together. He thought about the life he had lived before, the empty rooms in the city, the endless jobs that gave him no meaning. Now, though the ranch demanded more of him than anything ever had, it also gave him something he had never known before: belonging, family, a purpose larger than himself. One evening, as they all sat together by the fire, Clara looked at him with steady eyes. "You came here thinking you inherited land," she said softly. "But what you really inherited was us. And what we inherited was you. We needed each other." The room fell quiet at her words. Ruth reached for Anna's hand, and Margaret placed her palm on Ellen's shoulder. The man felt his throat tighten, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Clara was right. He had not only gained a ranch, but also people who trusted him, relied on him, and gave him the gift of family. It was not always easy. There were still long days of labor, still nights of worry when the skies grew dark. still neighbors who carried envy in their hearts. But every challenge they faced only made them stronger together. When the roof needed patching, they climbed ladders side by side. When a calf was born, they cheered like children. When the crops came in small, they laughed and reminded each other that next season would be better. The ranch itself seemed to recognize their bond. Where once the grass grew thin, it now stretched tall. Where fences leaned and broke, they now stood firm. Even the air seemed lighter, as if the land approved of the care being poured into it over time. The man stopped feeling like an outsider. Villagers stopped calling him the heir and began calling him the rancher. They stopped calling the women the widows and began calling them the family at the ranch. What had once been a strange household became an example of resilience and unity. The man often wondered about his uncle, the one who had left him this inheritance. He wished he could thank him, not for the land itself, but for the chance to find something greater. Perhaps his uncle had seen something in him that he had not yet seen in himself. Perhaps the old man knew that the ranch needed not just hands to work it, but hearts to love it. As another year passed, the ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It had become a place of hope. Children from the town sometimes visited, running through the fields and feeding the chickens. Travelers stopped by for water or rest, often leaving with smiles after being offered bread and kindness. The ranch was alive again, and so were the people who called it home. One night, as the stars glittered bright above them, Ruth whispered the thought that had been in all their hearts. Maybe we weren't waiting for the land to be saved. Maybe we were waiting for each other. The man looked around at the faces glowing in the firelight, each one marked by loss, but now softened with belonging. He smiled, his chest full with the kind of peace he had searched for all his life. He had inherited an old ranch, but in truth, he had inherited far more. He had inherited a family born from pain and rebuilt with love. And together, they had created a home that no storm, no greed, and no sorrow could ever take away.